thank Chairman Coates for giving me the opportunity to hold this hearing, and along with his staff in helping to prepare for today's hearing on the all-important subject of entrepreneurship and its importance to our economy. He unfortunately had another commitment this afternoon, but turned the gavel over to me for what I expect to be a very thought-provoking conversation about how we encourage entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs put ideas into action, and businesses they create make up a major component of America's economic job growth engine. Entrepreneurship also contributes to our standard of living by boosting job creation. Entrepreneurship drives economic growth, offers consumers better goods and services, and allows Americans to move up the economic ladder through their own innovations. America was once considered by far the best place for someone venturing out on their own. It was a place for taking a risk to build something new, to improve the lives of all Americans. And in places across the country, that's still the case, as you'll hear from our witnesses today. However, our current economic recovery has been relatively slow and certainly geographically uneven. In my home state of Ohio, as Mr. Walker will testify, Columbus has enjoyed great success in attracting new businesses and encouraging innovation. Other parts of the state, however, including many rural areas, Appalachia, have not recovered from the recession. Overall, we've seen a decline in the rates of startup companies, and an increase in the average age of companies compared to previous decades. It's our role as federal policymakers to foster a free market economy in which Americans enjoy ample opportunities for employment, and we must not forget that the private sector is the true driver of economic growth. Government can't tax and regulate its way to American prosperity. Every day, entrepreneurs launch new companies and decide where to place their headquarters. Those who incorporate here will face the highest corporate rate in the developed world, while those who structure to pay individual tax rates will grapple with mind-numbing complexity and tax rates that have risen substantially during this administration. Our uncompetitive tax code makes America less attractive as a place to do business. As if taking a risk on the success of an idea were not challenging enough, today's entrepreneurs also face a series of government-imposed market barriers. These include banking regulations that make it harder to get financing and harder for community banks to operate and make loans. Archaic licensing and permitting rules, and complex labor and health requirements. Each of these requires using precious resources, often to hire professionals, just to help navigate through all of it. As our witness Andrew McAfee said in a previous hearing on automation, entrepreneurs are facing an increasingly dense thicket of things that an employer or worker has to confront before they can start something up. And it looks like more and more people are saying, I'm just not going to bother with it. A friend of our family's in Columbus, Ohio, an Italian immigrant, started a family-owned business over 40 years ago. He has told me more than once the regulatory burden today that he faces, he couldn't start a business that he started 40 years ago. The mandates, the regulation, the risk to reward, the gap is too high. That's not what you'd like to hear from a successful entrepreneur today. We must continue to focus on ways to reduce the barriers to innovation, giving entrepreneurs the tools they need to succeed. That doesn't come from picking winners and losers with direct subsidies or carve-out tax breaks. Instead, that comes from preserving competition, removing restrictions that only serve to protect established companies and hinder startups with new ideas. We also need to remove barriers for those who want to invest in entrepreneurs and startups. My bipartisan legislation, the Investing in Opportunity Act, will make it easier to invest in areas that need it most, communities, rural and urban, that need help. Congress should boost entrepreneurship by reducing the thicket of bureaucracy that is strangling private initiative. It's my hope that here in America we can retain a strong entrepreneurial spirit rather than cause it to wither away. This time I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Maloney for her opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you so very, very much, Vice Chairman Tiberi. And thank you, too, to Chairman Coates for calling today's hearing, and thank you to all of our panelists. The United States is the most creative, innovative country in the world. We have the world's best research universities, its deepest financial markets, and we remain a magnet for the world's talent. If we leverage these assets, there is no doubt American innovators and entrepreneurs will continue to lead the world in years to come. New businesses are the lifeblood of our economy. Some startups go on to become big businesses worth billions of dollars. Others stay small but play a vital role in helping their founders achieve the American dream while creating jobs in their communities. However, data show that new businesses formed in America has been slowly declining for decades. One reason for this is the enormous and growing power of extremely large corporations, many of which have swallowed their competitors. This makes it much harder for new entrepreneurs to break into markets. Another reason is that the middle class, which has long fueled entrepreneurship in our country, has seen its economic foundation chipped away for decades. A third reason that entrepreneurs face a difficult environment is the fallout from the catastrophic financial crisis under George W. Bush. The recession hit aspiring entrepreneurs hard. Bank lending and other sources of financing dried up, and new businesses had an even harder time finding customers. Fortunately, there are signs that these trends have turned around. The U.S. recovery is the envy of the world. Since 2012, more businesses have opened than have closed. Bank lending to small businesses has ticked up. And the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, signed by President Obama in 2012, is now helping to facilitate crowdfunding. Last year, the Kauffman Foundation's Index of Growth Entrepreneurship posted its largest year-over-year increase in a decade. These are all good signs, but it's clear there is room for improvement. My Republican colleagues often attribute declining startup rates to the regulatory policies of the Obama administration. They are misguided. The decline has been going on for decades under both Democratic and Republican presidents. In fact, President Obama has issued fewer regulations than President George W. Bush did through the same point in his presidency. Moreover, it's unclear whether trends in regulations and in startup formation are related at all. As Dr. Kane writes in his testimony, a study by economists at George Mason University found that industries with more regulations actually have more startup activity. In addition, a recent report by the Economic Innovation Group found that just 20 countries were responsible for half of the net increase in new business establishments from 2010 to 2014. 9 of the 20 counties with the strongest new business growth are in the 10 states ranked by the Mercatus Center as having the most burdensome regulations. None of them are in the 10 states ranked as having the least burdensome regulations. Make no mistake, we should carefully review regulations to make sure that they are serving the best interest of the American families. Surely there are regulations that could be streamlined or improved to reduce the impact they have on new businesses. The private sector, government, and academia can each play a role in laying the groundwork for entrepreneurship and innovation. In my home district in New York, they are working together to help create Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island. It will be a world-class campus for applied science and engineering, bringing together innovators, entrepreneurs, and investors. Visionary projects like Cornell Tech can help serve as a catalyst to speed the movement of promising new discoveries from the lab through development and into manufacturing. These partnerships can also help our workforce develop the education and skills needed to innovate and build businesses. I want to close by highlighting another area of real promise, entrepreneurship among women and in communities of color. Between 2002 and 2012, the number of women-owned businesses grew more than 2.5 times faster than the national average. The number of businesses owned by women of color grew even faster than that. We need to build on this success and break down barriers so even more women can start and grow their own businesses. Again, I thank Chairman Coates and Vice Chairman Tiberi for holding this hearing, and I look forward to our witnesses' testimony. And I yield back. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the ranking member. I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses who are here today. We appreciate you being here, all 4 of you. Dr. Tim Kane is an economist and research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University In addition to senior research roles at the Kauffman Foundation and the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Kane has served twice as senior economist here at the Joint Economic Committee. Dr. Kane co-founded multiple software firms, and his startup, Economist.com, was awarded Software Startup of the Year in 1999. Dr. Kane earned a PhD in economics from UC San Diego and is also a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. Welcome back, Dr. Kane. Mr. Tom Walker is President and CEO of Rev1 Ventures, a Columbus, Ohio-based venture development firm. Mr. Walker previously served as the CEO and President of I2E Incorporated, an Oklahoma-based not-for-profit that focused on promoting entrepreneurship. He is an advisor to the National Angel Capital Association, an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship at the University of Tulsa, and is a reviewer for the Kauffman Foundation's e-venturing initiative. He holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Oklahoma and an MBA from Oklahoma City University. Welcome, Mr. Walker. Mr. Jamie Richardson is the Vice President of Government and Shareholder Relations for White Castle, a fourth-generation run, family-owned business. He serves on the board of Family Enterprise USA, the National Council of Chain Restaurants, and the Ohio Restaurant Association, where he now serves as its chairman. He holds an MBA from Ohio Dominican University and is a graduate of Siena Heights University with a degree in business administration. Welcome, Mr. Richardson. And our final witness is Ms. Carla Harris. Ms. Harris was appointed by President Obama to chair the National Women's Business Council and also serves as Vice Chairman of Global Wealth Management and a Senior Client Advisor at Morgan Stanley. Ms. Harris also serves as chair of the Morgan Stanley Foundation and sits on the boards of a number of nonprofits. She holds an MBA and an undergraduate degree from Harvard. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Harris. So I'll start from my left. We'll turn to Dr. Kane as the first witness, followed by Mr. Walker, Mr. Richardson, and Ms. Harris. Dr. Kane, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Can you turn on your microphone?
How's that? Thank you. Chair Tiberi, Ranking Minority Member Maloney, and members of the Joint Economic Committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. I am Tim Kane, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, a nonpartisan research institute at Stanford University. I represent my own views. Entrepreneurship remains poorly understood by economic theory, but it's well understood by farmers, struggling small business owners, and idle workers with big dreams. With my time, I'd like to connect 3 points of data. 3 points using empirical data. Point number one is that the U.S. economy has been experiencing a great deceleration. Along with Mrs. Maloney's point, this is extended back half a century. Each period of recovery during these last 50 years has been slower than the past, a trend that transcends political terms of presidents and partisan majorities here in Congress. In the first figure, I show the average annualized growth rate of GDP and its components, and I'm only counting data here for the expansionary periods, leaving out the recessions. This yields 5 expansions. Each expansion trough and peak is determined by the Business Cycle Dating Committee at the NBER, and of course, those expansions are different lengths of time. For example, the 1980s expansion started in the first quarter of 1983 and lasted until Q2 of 1990, for a total of 30 quarters. The late 70s expansion lasted only 19 quarters, whereas the 1990s expansion was 39 quarters long. Currently, the U.S. is in the 27th quarter of expansion, which looks like there's another recession coming soon. Each expansion is slower than the one before. This was a surprise. The growth rate was 4.5% during the late 1970s and the same during the 1980s expansions. The 1990s expansion saw a slightly slower growth rate, 3.8% per year, then 2.8% from 02 to 07. And the current era, this expansion has an average GDP growth rate of 2.1% per year. These are the good times. Now, Americans can feel this slowdown, and they're looking to us with questions. I wish I had easy answers for you. These growth rates count only real GDP, meaning after correcting for price inflation. And these past 50 years have been marked by a technological boom like nothing in human history. Mortality is lower, material quality of life is better in almost every way, food is cheaper and safer, and yet growth is slowing. A common reaction to the current slowdown among my fellow economists is that this is an illusion of demographics. This is incorrect. My second figure merges government data with government population data over the past 50 years. The average yearly growth rate of GDP per capita peaked at 4.15% per year, now 1.4% per year. If this trend continues, and I'm not saying it will, the U.S. economy will stop growing in the year 2030. I believe the trend can be reversed, and a rebirth of the American economy should be the government's top priority. Point number 2 is that the dynamism of the U.S. economy has been slowing for decades. Figure 3 shows the percentage of U.S. firms that are startups. During the Carter administration, it was roughly 14% of U.S. companies. Today, it's 8%, and this has not rebounded during the recovery years. With the decline in startups, there's been a decline in gross job creation and destruction. A study I published back in 2010 found that in most years, startups create 100% of all net new jobs. Research by John Haltewanger, Stephen Davis, and other economists associate the dynamism slowdown with reductions in productivity, real wages, and employment. Now, I should emphasize, immigrants are a vital source of entrepreneurial talent. Research shows that immigrants to the United States are significantly more likely to create new startups than native-born workers. Weak startup dynamism highlights a labor market problem. Government is discouraging entrepreneurship. It's passive, maybe unintentional, but the institutional hostility to entrepreneurs is very real. Again, I don't think this is just because of the Obama administration. It's a trend that goes back in time, but I do think this is the primary cause. It is government regulation. Point number 3, taxes are more complex, regulations are thicker, employment law is more dangerous. More than 1 in 3 workers today need a government license to work, compared to 1 in 20 in the 1950s. Occupational licensing not only hinders employment levels, but hinders occupational mobility, and has been criticized by liberals and conservatives alike, including the Obama administration. The country is hamstrung by laws that are effectively anti-work. The highest marginal tax rates are not faced by CEOs and hedge fund managers, but by single working mothers. It's the entrepreneur, not the corporate executive, who faces real risks. And until workers and entrepreneurs are given an environment that rewards work and smart risk-taking, there can be no solid recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Mr. Walker, recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Teaberry, Ranking Member Maloney, and members of the Joint Economic Committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today regarding encouraging entrepreneurship growth. Today, my name is Tom Walker. I'm CEO of Rev 1 Ventures, located in Columbus, Ohio. Today, I'd like to visit with you about a very successful approach to creating high-growth startups in the country, and we'll target specifically Columbus, Ohio. Rev 1 Ventures is a seed-stage investor that combines investment capital and strategic services to help entrepreneurs build great companies. We are a true public-private partnership created as a 501c3 focused solely on that mission. How can we help high-growth entrepreneurs create businesses in our backyard that can thrive for years to come? We know that connecting and leveraging the assets in our backyard can have a tremendous effect if you connect them to entrepreneurs and then help them start their companies, and that's been our focus. In Columbus, we have a strong mix of assets. We have terrific research institutions in the Ohio State University, the Nationwide Children's Research Institute, Battelle Memorial Institute, and the Ohio Health Network, as well as a tremendous corporate base, 14 Fortune 1000s, and then a whole host of companies a tier below that are just very significant. As the 15th largest state, Ohio benefits from a strong and growing economy. Back in 2012, the assets were strong, but the startup economy was not. The Columbus region was not on the map for generating new businesses. If we fast forward to 2016, in just a few years, we've accomplished what some regions have taken decades or more to do, receiving national validation in that time frame. In fact, Columbus is ranked #1 region in the country in 2016 for scaling startups on a per capita basis, and the fastest growing city for startup activity in 2015, and Columbus ranked #4 in the U.S. for growth entrepreneurship in 2016's overall Kauffman Index. Rev 1 was recently named the most active venture investor in the Great Lakes region between 2012 and 2015 by PitchBook, and just a few weeks ago, CB Insights ranked Rev 1 as the #1 investor in Ohio. We are on pace to generate a $2 billion economic impact to our region just through the startup companies that we're helping to launch. So how did we do this? Well, the state of Ohio has had a very aggressive and very innovative program called the Ohio Third Frontier Program. And that program provides state matching dollars to the private sector for starting new seed funds for the sole purpose of providing services to new high-growth startups in that region. Rev 1 is fortunate to be able to access those state dollars, but it encourages us to bring in private match to do that, to accomplish the mission that we work so very hard on. The centerpiece of our strategy is connecting those assets in our backyard that I mentioned previously. So how can we work to bring the successful corporate and research base to bear to help the entrepreneurs and the startup community? We then provide startups world-class mentoring, capital, and access to customers. We then invest in the brightest opportunities to attract talent and capital to our region. As an example, through innovation partnerships like the Ohio State University and Nationwide Children's Research Institute and Ohio Health, we are helping spin out more technology opportunities into the marketplace that are based on federal research dollars. So we're really starting to move the needle in commercialization in our region. So the federal government can be a catalyst for momentum in this area. Entrepreneurs need help. The private sector won't bear 100% of the cost for a region to scale and be competitive, so public sector has to invest where it can be a catalyst. There's a dramatic gap in capital and support for startups outside of regions such as Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, and Austin. As we've proven in Ohio through the Ohio Third Frontier Program, there are proven ways that government can be a catalyst for new company startups and growth by providing early-stage capital and services that attract matching capital from angels, venture capitalists, and corporations. The federal government has done this before. The State Small Business Capital Incentives Program, SSBCI, through the Treasury Department, helped regions raise capital that couldn't otherwise access. SSBCI no longer exists, but it's something the federal government could explore doing again. If Congress were to pursue this type of program, we would suggest following best practices of states such as Ohio that use a proven stringent metrics that can show a return on investment and access to private sector dollars. A few final thoughts on areas of federal policy this committee may wish to consider. The U.S. should maximize federal investment in research dollars to incent development of new businesses. The committee should explore innovations based on federally funded research to include some portion of their scoring process focused on commercialization of technology. Continue to evaluate and make less bureaucratic the FDA approval process for medical technologies. These companies face a unique set of challenges in garnering federal approval through the FDA before getting their products into clinical trials and ultimately to the marketplace. And finally, continue to monitor the recent federal changes to the U.S. patent system. One of the biggest threats to entrepreneurs and those that invest in them is adequately protecting the intellectual property of startup companies and also continuing to make the process more streamlined. Chairman Berry and Ranking Member Maloney and members of the committee, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, for your testimony. Mr. Richardson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Berry, Ranking Member Maloney, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for this chance to testify today on behalf of White Castle and the National Restaurant Association. I'm Jamie Richardson, Vice President at White Castle, and also Chairman of the Ohio Restaurant Association. As a family-owned business celebrating our 95th birthday, I would like to tell you today that White Castle's growth has continued uninterrupted. I would like to tell you that, but I cannot. In fact, White Castle's growth has halted. In 2012, when I testified before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee on the Affordable Care Act, we had 408 White Castle restaurants. Today, we have 390. While other factors have taken a toll, it is the mounting uncertainty and the collective effect of a legislative and regulatory regime hostile to job creation that is bringing us to a standstill. We are not alone. More than 1 of 5 restaurant operators report government is their #1 biggest challenge, a higher proportion than the economy. This doesn't just discourage the risk-taking needed for entrepreneurship, it crushes it in the cradle. Restaurants provide incredible careers, and we're employers of choice for people looking for flexible work schedules. Despite our appeal, our industry runs on narrow margins, averaging just 4 to 6% before taxes. We're a driving force for entrepreneurship, where a favorite family recipe becomes an inspiration for the next successful dining destination. And we're a driving force for innovation and for preparing today's employees for a changing workplace and the promise of tomorrow. White Castle's founder, Billy Ingram, had two key entrepreneurial ideas that were pretty radical and risky in 1921. First, happy employees make happy customers, and second, we have no right to expect loyalty except from those to whom we are loyal. 95 years later, these principles shape all we do, driving incredible employee and guest devotion. In fact, more than 1 in 4 of our 10,000 team members has been with us 10 years or more. The average tenure of our restaurant general managers is 21 years. Yet, along with restaurants throughout the country, we face debilitating regulatory barriers and burdens and unprecedented economic challenges. I could give you dozens of examples. I'll concentrate on just two. First, the Affordable Care Act requires offering full-time team members defined in the ACA as employees working 30 hours or more per week health care coverage or face potential penalties. The ACA's definition of full-time employment as 30 hours per week is out of step with the traditional full-time employment standard of 40 hours per week. Many employees in our industry are already losing wages and hours due to the law's perverse incentives, especially part-time employees who until now were those working below the traditional 40 hours per week. One of the attractive benefits for restaurant employees had been flexible scheduling. Employees can adjust their hours to suit their personal needs and even pick up additional hours to earn extra income when desired. Part-time jobs with flexible scheduling are appealing and often critical for students, single parents, and those struggling to balance a wide range of commitments. Harmonizing the ACA definition of full-time employment with the traditional 40-hour per week standard would benefit employees through more hours and income. Secondly, the Department of Labor recently published new overtime regulations in effect this December, adding to the uncertainty ever-expanding federal regulations have created over the last 5 years. When combined with ACA rules and regs, this is a vicious 1-2 punch for employers. The overtime regulations will have a negative impact on restaurant workers everywhere, now benefiting from the advantages of exempt status. Non-exempt employees often have less workplace autonomy and fewer opportunities for flexible work arrangements, career training, and advancement than their exempt counterparts. For restaurants, the proposed minimum salary level represents an outsized income for entry-level managers. The increase would be too large for many employers to observe, so some employees would be dragged back to an hourly rate. This change to non-exempt status can lead to fewer opportunities for career advancement. Changing to non-exempt status requires employers and employees to watch the clock. Employees near 40 hours in a week may need to skip additional training or other career-building opportunities because the employer isn't able to pay overtime rates for that time. This squashes creativity and entrepreneurial spirit. Finally, the department has given the impression salaried employees feel taken advantage of by virtue of their exempt status. In reality, where we live and work and raise our families, employees often view reclassifications to non-exempt status as a demotion. Exempt status is a symbol of success and hard work. We are both proud and grateful for the responsibility of serving America's communities, creating jobs, boosting the economy, and satisfying customers. Enterprising restaurants are committed to working with Congress to find solutions fostering job growth and truly benefiting our communities. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Wow, 4 minutes and 59 seconds. That's pretty good. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Ms. Harris, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Vice Chair Taveri and Ranking Member Maloney and distinguished members of the committee. Oh, sorry. I'll try that again. Vice Chair Pat Taveri, Ranking Member Maloney, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of the National Women's Business Council before the Joint Economic Committee for today's hearing. My name is Carla Harris, and I am the presidentially appointed chair of the National Women's Business Council. The council is a nonpartisan federal advisory council created to serve as an independent source of advice and counsel to the U.S. Small Business Administration, Congress, and the White House on issues of impact and importance to women business owners, leaders, and entrepreneurs. Women-owned firms represent an important segment of the business sector. As of 2012, women-owned businesses comprise 36%, or nearly 10 million of the country's privately held businesses. These firms generate over $1 trillion in sales and employ over 8 million people. Between 2012 2002 and 2012, the number of women-owned firms increased at a rate of 2.5 times the national average. Employment in women-owned firms grew at a rate of 4.5 times that of all firms, and the growth in revenues generated by women-owned firms paralleled that of all firms. Some of the most dynamic changes since 2007 SBO can be witnessed, as already referenced, for women of color, especially Black and Latina women. For example, in 2007, there were about 900,000 Black-owned women businesses. Now they stand strong at over 1.5 million and represent almost 60% of all Black-owned businesses. Since 2007, Black women-owned firms have added over 71,000 jobs to our economy, while Black men-owned firms have added almost 11,000 jobs. Latina-owned businesses increased at even greater numbers. In 2007, there were fewer than 800,000 Latina-owned firms. Now there are nearly 1.5 million. These numbers demonstrate that women-owned businesses are thriving thanks to a combination of supportive initiatives and policies and a strong entrepreneurial spirit. However, inequities and disparities still exist that inhibit many women-owned firms from reaching their full economic impact or scaling effectively. All of us here today can agree that we want regulations as efficient and effective for our small businesses, including those that are women-owned, to continue to start, sustain, and grow as a strong force in our economy. We often describe our work at the National Women's Business Council as divided among 4 pillars, which include data collection and analysis, access to capital, access to markets, and job creation and growth. Common sense regulation plays a role in each and any of these areas. Today, I specifically focus on access to capital and job creation and growth by describing how women and others stand to gain from full transparency in the areas of marketplace lending, as well as minimized or consolidated regulation in the area of occupational licensing. Most importantly, however, we want to acknowledge the value of early and frequent involvement of women business owners and all stakeholders in developing and refining regulation. Access to capital continues to be a challenge for too many women. NWBC's work focuses on changing the infrastructure and on increasing and improving resources so more women can access the capital they need to start and grow their businesses. Per council research, on average, men start their businesses with nearly twice as much capital as women. Babson College has concluded that the lack of sufficient capital funding for women entrepreneurs will cost the economy nearly 6 million jobs over the next 5 years. So it is in the best interest of the economy and the country to understand any barriers to these firms' success. Fortunately, the marketplace is responding to the challenges that women have faced in accessing capital in the forms of both loans and equity investments. Thanks to great innovation in the capital space with crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, microfinancing, and more women have greater opportunities to pursue and raise the capital that they need. Beginning with an examination of debt, it is important to understand that women business owners take traditional business loans far less frequently than the overall population of women business owners. Beyond the Community Advantage Program, the SBA Microloan Program, which is the largest single source of funding for microfinance institutions in the United States, it provides direct funding to qualified community finance organizations who then issue the loans to borrowers. Women entrepreneurs have historically been underserved by lending institutions, so these programs, as well as private marketplace lenders, are stepping in with capital and technical assistance, enabling strong performance by these women's businesses by increasing their available capital included in the lower dollar values commonly sought by women business owners. With respect to equity, I would be very pleased to take any questions from the committee on this topic, but I will move on out of respect for time. With respect to occupational certification, there are important reasons to require licensure. We want to ensure consumers' protection, just as we would like for qualified individuals to have a competitive edge. However, as already referenced, the costs associated with obtaining a license may serve as a barrier to women starting businesses in these industries, as well as their ability to hire qualified employees. Women business owners stand to benefit from reasonable regulation that minimizes financial barriers to launching and growing enterprises. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Mr. Richardson, Many adults, including myself, got their start in your industry. My first job was at McDonald's. I did about everything you could imagine there. But it was a great experience because I learned life lessons, starting with showing up on time, customer's always right, personal responsibility. And it seems to me that one of my concerns with respect to your testimony regarding the cumulative regulatory burden, as you put it in your written testimony, is that there are, at least anecdotally, fewer and fewer of these entry-level jobs. When I go into a restaurant, I don't see as many 16-year-olds working those jobs. And so, people like me who worked when I started at 16 at McDonald's and then a gas station pumping gasoline, which is not happening anymore either, I could save a little bit of money for college. Without these opportunities, it seems also to me that there are fewer chances that that person might have a career in an industry, have an opportunity to manage that restaurant, maybe someday own that restaurant. So as we talk about social regulations that attempt to regulate our qualities of life, as someone who's been in this industry for a while, my question to you would be, how do the regulations that you mentioned in your written testimony, and you specifically mentioned the Affordable Care Act, you mentioned Department of Labor, NLRB, how have they hurt White Castle's specific ability to hire that 16 or 17-year-old, that high school student, versus 25, 30 years ago, where maybe you hired more of them?
Thank you, Chairman T. Berry. For White Castle, as a family-owned business, we've always been the heart and soul of the neighborhoods where we live, work, and raise our families. And so today, we're part of urban neighborhoods around the country. We're in 12 markets. And for us, that employment opportunity we're able to provide is a path to prosperity for so many. I mentioned that more than 1 in 4 of our team members have been with us 10 years or more. Sometimes folks come in and want to work for a weekend or a month or two, and they make it a career. So I think for us, the biggest barrier is especially those regs that interfere with our ability to give people that opportunity. So, for instance, the Affordable Care Act and the new definition of full-time is 30 hours really puts a barrier between us and our employees in terms of not allowing us to give them the hours we'd want to be able to give them. Secondly, with the overtime reg, that's really tough because those people who want to move up, our general managers are very entrepreneurial. They're involved in community. They're volunteering at the local food bank or the local YMCA because they want to be part of that fabric of community. So for us, the tough part is to look and see the unintended consequences of regs that prevent us from hiring people in the neighborhoods where we want to provide the most employment.
And you've had that happen. That exact effect has happened.
The day the Affordable Care Act passed, we had 418 restaurants. Today we have 390. The math has changed dramatically in terms of our costs. Restaurants typically run on very narrow margins. White Castle, we put a lot of money back into retirement benefits and health care benefits we've offered since 1924. We run on narrower margins, candidly. Our typical profit margin in a year, in a good year, is 1% to 2%. So when you start to elevate costs, there aren't too many pennies left over, or half penny, or whatever it may be. So that's the real barrier and pressure we feel.
Mr. Walker, what do you see as the greatest impediment to starting a new business?
Thank you for that question. I see it twofold. It's access to capital and talent. And a lot of times, if you have the capital, you can find the talent. And in this country, for the high-growth startups, so technology-based startup companies, it takes risk capital. So these companies aren't bankable, so they can't go to a bank and acquire a loan. They take either angel investment, which is investment from high-net-worth individuals, or venture capitalists. Well, the venture capital industry is really concentrated in roughly 5 markets in the United States, see roughly more than 92% of the dollars every year. So if you're in a region outside of one of those 5 cities, it's very difficult to access the venture capital that is required. And we're also seeing now there are fewer venture firms today than there were 10 years ago, and there are more going out of business than are being created. So it's getting harder and harder for venture firms to raise the investment dollars to put into these startup companies that create jobs, high-growing companies. Part of that problem relates back to Sarbanes-Oxley and sort of the constraints placed on the IPO market, because that's where startups get the returns back to the investors. So it's sort of a vicious cycle, but that's why you're seeing now across the country more and more regions, cities are creating initiatives to create seed capital programs and public-private partnerships, much like Rev 1, so they can start those companies in a homegrown effort. But we still see a dramatic lack of capital to help grow these companies to scale.
So related to that, in Ohio, if you take our state of Ohio, Columbus clearly has had more growth in startups in other parts of the state. And there are clearly other parts of the state, Appalachian areas in eastern Ohio, cities that have a rich history but have struggled in recent years, like Youngstown, more difficult. In your opinion, why has that been uneven? Why is it more difficult to start a startup in a city like Youngstown or Appalachia versus a city like Columbus? What's the differentiating point?
Traditionally in the U.S., high-growth startups create in and around urban areas. So you're seeing a higher growth rate in those kinds of startup companies in larger cities. Their access to more resources, service providers, those talent, those types of things. So that is one impediment. The other is it's difficult to find access to capital in some of these smaller markets.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, I thank all of the panelists, and building on Mr. Walker's statements, also a lot of startups start where there are universities, where there are research dollars. And you noted in your testimony that the importance of federal dollars for initial research to then start new industries and to move forward. I do want to note, with all of our difficulties and challenges, all economists have noted that after the Great Recession, America bounded back faster than any of our competitors, our allies, our others that were hit by the Great Recession around the world. And part of it was because of our ability to continue to try new approaches to solve problems and move forward. We have created over 14.7 million new private sector jobs since President Obama took office, and there was a 76-month stretch of private sector job growth, at one point the longest in the history of our country. So there's a great deal to be proud of in our country also. I would say we lead the world in many areas, and one of them is certainly in business leadership and innovation, and we certainly need to continue that. One of the biggest threats we face in that area is the cutback in federal funding for research. So much of what we've created has come initially. Private sector businesses can't afford to invest in that necessary research. I was struck very much, Ms. Harris, by your statement that, and really some of the research that we've done on this committee, that so many new businesses are founded by women, and particularly women of color have gone out and started new businesses. And I'd like to ask you why you think that is. Is that part of it the glass ceiling, that they reach a glass ceiling, there's no other place to go within the, quote, establishment, so they move out and start their own business and go forward? But we've done other studies that showed we're still stuck at 79 cents to the dollar, and that unfairness in pay then ends up in having more and more women in poverty and older age as their pensions are lower, their Social Security is lower, their savings are lower. One area that we worked on with Ms. Adams and Mr. Byers, we did a study on how many women are on boards, and found that just 16% of the seats on the boards are women. And this is counter, really, to research we've seen actually in your firm, Morgan Stanley, Ms. Harris. It showed that when there's more diverse board, particularly gender diversity, that the bottom line shows more growth and more profits. So why do you think it is that there's such a, usually when business sees that something helps them grow their bottom line, they jump in there and make it happen. But we're not seeing that with women on boards. It's been roughly, or women CEOs. The number of CEOs have stayed primarily the same. The people change. But the growth of women on boards is nowhere near where it should be. And this, of course, then, as you said in your testimony, then falls over into other categories of not participating in businesses. And you said it carries over to investment firms. And what can we do, Ms. Harris, do you think, to increase the number of women who enter the management and are in a position to affect investment decisions?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think there are three things that the industry and any industry can do to increase the number of women in positions of leadership. The first thing is to be really intentional about it and making sure that you promote those women who are qualified, that are coming through the pipeline. And I think you need to be intentional about filling the pipeline from entry level all the way through, and create programs within the organizations that will support the women's development throughout their career, and more importantly, provide them with the sponsors that are needed as you get more senior. Because as you know, once you get to a certain level, it's not just about the performance. You've proven the performance over a number of years, but it's about having the right sponsorship to actually get to the more senior levels. And I think you need to be intentional about that. The second thing is I think you need to have a measure of accountability, because if you're going to have these kinds of programs, it not only flows from the top, but it has to happen in the middle. And you need to be able to make sure that management is accountable for having a diverse pipeline, because once you start losing people through natural reasons, natural attrition, you look up and then you don't have anybody to promote to the senior levels. And the last thing is that you need to be consistent. So intentionality, accountability, and consistency is what you need in these firms if you want to make sure that you get senior people to the top. And once you get senior people to the top, you'll be able to attract even more talent that's diverse, like that top management. So that's my opinion.
Ladies,
Thank you
time
very
has
much.
expired.
My time has expired.
Senator Klobuchar, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And very important topic today. I think about our small and big businesses. Target actually started out in Minnesota as a dry goods store. Best Buy started out as a startup stereo store called Sound of Music. I don't know if you, not the movie. And 3M started out way up in Duluth. So we have a lot of that in our state, as well as small businesses that are thriving as small businesses. So I guess the first one of you, Mr. Walker, in your testimony, you talked about the Ohio Frontier Program, state bonding program, invest in startups. I think a lot of the good ideas that we've seen in our state and across the country come from the states. Could you describe that for us?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The Ohio Third Frontier Program is a state program that is voted by the people. It's a bond program. Those dollars are targeted towards the creation of high-growth, high-tech startup businesses and creating a seed capital infrastructure. And the way it works is nonprofit private companies such as Rev1 throughout the state can compete for those dollars, but you compete on a matching with private sector dollars one-to-one. So in action, in Columbus as an example, we have some nearly 50 corporate partners that fund our operation, and for every dollar they provide us, I'm able to go to the Third Frontier at the state level and match those dollars. So for a small nonprofit like ourselves who are trying to start as many companies as we can, that provides ample resources for us to provide support services for those startups, as well as seed capital. And in fact, we've utilized those dollars to become one of the most active seed investors in the Great Lakes region.
Thank you. And along those same lines, Ms. Harris, do you want to talk about the importance of the SBA Intermediate Lending Program or any other lending program for businesses making less than $200,000?
Yes, I think there are other...
Seeking less, sorry.
Yes, there are other programs that I think should be supported, including peer-to-peer lending, firms like Lending Club, Prosper Funding Circle, women-focused investment firms, as well as crowdfunding, and then lenders with new scoring methodology.
Thank you. And a little different topic, and that is something I think we'll be hoping working on next year again, and that's immigration reform. People don't always think about it as an economic issue, but it is one in many ways. 70 of our Fortune 500 companies were formed by immigrants. The figure a few years back, 200 formed by immigrants or kids of immigrants. 25% of U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. Could any of you can address this, but the importance of comprehensive immigration reform from a business innovation standpoint? Dr. Kane, you're smiling. I don't
Yes,
know if
ma'am.
That's good or bad for
Well,
me.
Senator, I lead an effort at Stanford under the Hoover Institution, a journal called Peregrine, which promotes immigration reform. We published 5 issues. We're working on a book, assembled people left, right, and center in an expert survey. So I have much more than 5 minutes to talk on, but let me echo your sentiments. I think high-skill immigrants are just great for the U.S. economy. Research shows that. And guess what? Low-skill immigrants are great for the U.S. economy. I think being a nation with the Statue of Liberty that the rest of the world sees as the icon sort of highlights who we are, what's made us great, and what's made us grow strong. So I could get into more details, but I think that the consensus is that policymakers should get behind immigration reform. If I can just dig in a little bit, I'm not sure the comprehensive is seen as a good idea anymore, that that's seen as a way that this issue gets stuck. And if we could focus on where the American people want Congress to go, it's to stop the talk about deportations and to stop the talk about free citizenship, to create a legal status work visa that will bring people out of the shadows, get them to work, allow them to start companies, and contribute to the economy.
Anyone want to add anything?
From a restaurant point of view, we're strong supporters of comprehensive immigration reform. We know that all you need to be successful in our business is a heart for hospitality, so we welcome new arrivals. And
Yeah.
if you ever want to see something fun, go to the National Restaurant Association's Faces of Diversity Awards. It is super cool, and it just shows how hard people have worked who are new arrivals, the impact they have on their communities, and we're an industry of opportunity.
You should know, Mr. Richardson, that my home is 4 blocks from a White Castle, and that's how I always identify it for people. I go, oh, it's from near the White Castle. Okay, Ms. Harris on immigration?
Nothing to add to what's been
Okay.
said.
Very good. Well, I'm just very hopeful that we can take this up again. As you know, the Senate worked hard on this issue. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. We had both the Chamber and the AFL-CIO, and I once did a hearing on this committee with Representative Brady was here, and I actually called Grover Norquist, you'd like this, Dr. Kane, as my witness, because he showed how it brought the debt down, passing comprehensive immigration reform. Thank you all of you.
Now, ladies, time has expired. Mr. Hanna is recognized for 5 minutes.
No, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. The underlying theme is that there's too much regulation. I wonder about the law of large numbers with growth, how that plays into your statement, Mr. Kane. But there's a thing in Congress that passed the floor, the Republican majority, called the REINS Act, that, if you're familiar with it, it basically said we had to analyze the proposal by the executive branch to see that it was cost, if it was $100 million or more, it required further investigation, right, that kind of thing. But for me, that makes some sense, but not all the sense, because in an effort to create a perfect outcome, a lot of times we actually undo the very thing that we're trying to protect. And I think that's kind of the theme here among all of you. And I guess you're an expert in this. Can you give me a sense of how you would see that managed? Anyone?
Sure. Just briefly, I think on some of the testimony I heard, and I like the testimony of all of my fellow members here, testifiers. I think there was just great wisdom here, and I think the continuity of identifying occupational licensing as a barrier is one of the key regulatory barriers. But as much as I love venture capital, and I've received money from venture capitalists before, and I think banking's great, realize we just look at historical examples going back to the country's founding. We were an entrepreneurial people long before there was venture capital or modern banking, and most people were entrepreneurs. And I think when we look at the difference between urban entrepreneurship and rural entrepreneurship, it's that maybe it's become so formalized, and that you need, in all 50 states, you need to pay a fee just to exist as a small business. And I think it's bizarre that not one governor seized on that and said, you know what, in our state, in our high school, every graduate of our high school or every 11th grader, we're going to encourage them to start a business. And they're not going to have to risk lawsuits. We're going to make it easy for them. And instead, they're sort of treated as the enemy of the working man. You start a company, you must want to oppress people. That's sort of a backwards mindset that I think is, if I can say, anti-American or un-American.
Sure, and a lot of it's designed to protect the existing industry, right? Whether
Absolutely.
it's real estate or home, something as simple as fingernails and home braiding and things like that.
Right.
And the caveat emptor, the buyer can manage that much better than the government. The problem is, it's, as you suggest, it's out of control. I'm from New York, and we have a declining population, a huge problem with competitiveness and an aging population. And a lot of it, I think, reverts back to that. Mr. Walker, I'm interested in what you might want to say.
Well, I think you're spot on. I appreciate the question. I think there are times that we try and correct one problem, but we close the door on things that were working, you know. So we think about sort of the decline in the IPO market over the past 10 years. And, you know, I think many experts point directly to Sarbanes-Oxley for those kinds of things. I think you can look at historical economic conditions such as the dot-com bust in the early 2000s that at that time the SBA had a venture capital program that would help create venture firms, but because, you know, after the crash, that program was killed in terms of an equity program. So there are times where we maybe close the door on things that were working.
And Mr. Richardson, one quick question. The overtime rule, I think from my memory, $23,000 to $46,000. You're familiar with it, right? It's
Correct, yeah.
Would you have been happy with $35,000?
You know, we submitted,
You know what I mean?
we actually in our written comments proposed $29,500. That would be
So you were okay
inflationary.
with the premise?
We understand the idea. There's need for adjustment as time goes on, correct?
Thank you. Go back.
All right, Mr. Rothman.
Two real quick ones, because we're voting. First of all, for any of you, just yes or no. If we went back and put the regulatory situation at where it was in the year 2000, after 8 years of Bill Clinton being president, does anyone think there'll be any problems with going back to the year 2000? Just tear up any new, more onerous regulations since then?
Less is more, sir.
Okay.
We concur.
Okay, good. Well, that's a good goal for the new president. And next question from Ms. Harris. I know he's engaged a little bit of the problem here is that, you know, the men have it so easy and the women have it so tough. I sometimes walk back from, say, something on the northwest side of Washington. I don't know how you live in Washington. I don't know whether you live in Washington.
No.
Harris? You don't?
No.
Well, I'm going to ask you to comment, because I think the same thing is probably true in most big urban cities. When I walk back from the northwest side of Washington, I bet, say when I walk back from the White House, I may see 150 homeless people preparing to fall asleep at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And I bet of those 150, 149 are men. Do you care to comment on, you know, now we've got to do more to help, you know, not help the men, but do you care to comment on why, if there's so many women living in poverty and so few men, why all these homeless people are men?
Well, I can't comment on why they are men, and that might have to do with where you are walking in the city. There might be other parts of the city where you might find more women, so that would be a hard one for me to comment on.
Okay, thank you.
So unfortunately, we have a vote going on. That's why everyone's kind of left. I want to thank you all for testifying, and I'd like to just say appreciate your time. And the record will be open for 5 days for any member that would like to submit questions for the record to any of the four of you. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks so much.